Good evening, everybody. Welcome to School Psych Podcast. Really excited to have you tonight. Hope that everybody fared well with their holiday and their break and is, returning safely shortly to school. I know that I'm kind of waiting for a potential phone call for a snow day, and so I'm I'm excited for that. So if that happens to pop up while we're live, we're just gonna pause for a minute and celebrate. But we'll see how that goes. But my name is Rachel. I'm a school psychologist. I'm in Maryland. I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca, who's going to tell everybody how to participate tonight for this awesome follow-up topic. Rebecca.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Rebecca, and I'm excited to have you here on this night before the first day of school in January. If you are watching us live, then if you're signed into your YouTube account, you can just comment right alongside the video. We're all looking for notifications, and we can even share those comments right on our video screen, which is a pretty cool feature of our platform. But if you'd also like to comment or ask questions on either of the Facebook pages, you can comment on the School Psych Podcast. Speaking is new for me this week. The School Psych Podcast page on Facebook, or School Psych, your school psychologist. And you can message, so that's a more private way to comment or ask a question or share what's going on in your district or coming up for you this week. And also on Twitter, @PodcastPsyched is our handle, and you can use the hashtag #PsychedPodcast. So I'll look for that as well. And now I'm going to hand it off to Eric, who's going to introduce our fabulous returning guest.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. My name is Eric, and I'm a school psychologist also in the state of Connecticut. And we're excited to have Dr. Imad Zaheer back with us again. We spoke to him a couple of years ago and talked about ACT, the acceptance commitment therapy. And we've done some diving into that ourselves, learning as school psychologists what ACT is, and have gotten to speak with Dr. Stephen Hayes and gotten to learn a little more about ACT through other webinars and podcasts and books. And so we're excited to have Dr. Zaheer back with us to revisit this with us and talk more about how we can apply this in our practice as school psychologists. And just a little bit about Dr. Zaheer, if you did not get to hear about him during his first podcast with us, he's also had some career changes. He's now at St. John's University from Montclair State University in New Jersey, now in New York. So Dr. Zaheer is an assistant professor of school psychology in the Department of Psychology at St. John's University. He is a pediatric school psychologist and has worked on numerous projects in clinics, hospitals, and public and alternative school settings that involve direct and indirect consultation services across individual, group, and systems levels. His areas of interest are in developing assessments and intervention for children with emotional and behavior challenges, and creating comprehensive school-based prevention programs by integrating school mental health, social and emotional learning, and school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports. So welcome, Dr. Zaheer. It's great to have you back.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back, even though I'm a little anxious to follow up Dr. Hayes on the topic of ACT. But I'm excited to be here, especially on the first or second day of the new year.
Yeah, we're happy to have you here. Well, I know you have some PowerPoint slides for us. Should we jump into that, or do we want to do a little intro about what ACT is, or anything quick, or do you want to cover that in the PowerPoint?
Sure. Yeah, I'll share my slides here and just let me know if you can see them. So I'll just put them in presentation mode.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I did create some slides just as a reminder for ACT, especially if someone's watching that the previous 2 episodes on ACT itself. So we are revisiting this topic. So very, very quickly, I did want to wish everybody Happy New Year's for those that are joining us. And I'm also, there's no snow that's going to be happening here, but I'm also rooting for the snow for wherever you are, if it gives you an extra day for break. But for today, I actually wanted to see if we can revisit ACT in a slightly different way. And especially because it's New Year's or around New Year's, really looking at aspects of values and goals and how we can use actually metaphors to carry this forward in terms of as we go throughout our school year and our calendar year. So I know right now this is the time where a lot of us are setting, various goals, New Year's resolutions, and I think ACT actually provides us a unique framework on how we can actually approach some of those type of tasks, but maybe in a slightly different way. So I figured I can do a quick overview of ACT itself, just as a reminder, and then we can kind of go into these topics. I did kind of plan a stopping point after each one of these topics or values and goals and metaphors in case there's questions or if we want to have any discussions around it. But I also wanted to make sure we walk through a few practical tools that people can use in putting these ACT practices in place. So just as a very quick reminder, the one thing that we really focus on when we're thinking about acceptance commitment therapy is the idea of psychological flexibility. So the model in ACT is really focused on enhancing our flexibility, our psychological flexibility, which is defined as the ability to experience and notice uncomfortable internal content like thoughts, emotions, or memories, and still persistent actions towards what or who we value. And this model actually looks at psychological flexibility in many different ways. So this triangle here with all these different ideas indicate that we can break up psychological flexibility into processes about how we open up to our own experience. So diffusion usually indicates how we can unhook from experiences that might catch us. And in CBT terms, this might be a thought that we're stuck in. So we can diffuse from that thought and become more flexible. And then in terms of acceptance skills, this is oftentimes getting around our sometimes our need to avoid our experiences. So if there's a difficult memory or an emotion, how do we practice more acceptance skills to be present with that emotion so that we can persist in those actions that are going to be valuable for us. There's also being present skills. And this is probably the one that I think in some ways stereotypically we think of when we think of mindfulness. And this is really how do we stay in contact with the present moment. So just being here and now. And then also thinking about self as context, which is really recognizing that we're having certain thoughts and emotions and experiences in a particular context. And then finally, we have do what matters. And this one's really tied to values as well as committed actions that we can take. So really getting at that point of what kinds of changes we're going to make, often focusing more on our overt behaviors. And this makes up the core of acceptance and commitment therapy. So there's acceptance processes as well as commitment processes. And one of the nice things about this model is that it really focuses on both aspects of it. So I think a lot of times we kind of think of these two things as even competing, right? If we're really focused on acceptance, then commitment kind of cuts against it. And the ACT model really tries to balance these two focuses. So we're focusing on acceptance as well as committing to change that we're going to make. And I actually just wanted to quickly point out that I hope I never would have to show this slide again. But I think right now it might actually be timely. When the pandemic first started, Dr. Russ Harris actually released this acronym Face COVID, which was looking to apply some of these ACT strategies to what's happening with COVID and the pandemic. And it was a nice little acronym of really, focusing on what you can control, acknowledging your thoughts and feelings, coming back into your body, engaging with what you're doing, and then also committing to actions, opening up to your experiences, following and pursuing your values, identifying any resources, and disinfecting and distancing. I couldn't really find a good place to throw in masks and vaccinations here, but I think it was a nice way to capture a lot of the different things we would be doing in ACT in the current situation that a lot of us are facing during COVID. So I wanted to just throw this in as a reminder of how we can often put ACT into practice for different situations. But I really wanted to focus today on the aspect of ACT I think that's actually underrepresented in a lot of our trainings and our conversations. And that's really on the commitment side. And I think partly this is because the commitment piece is in some ways the older piece. It's the behavior therapy and change processes that we've known for a long period of time. And as a result, I think we tend to focus a lot more on the acceptance processes because they're newer. Especially when we're thinking about mindfulness, that was one of the big additions that ACT was adding on to traditional CBT. So this was something that really became more of that focus. But I do want to point out that on the commitment side, one of the things that's really important, and I would probably even say one of the main things that drew me into ACT, was the focus on values and how that ties into committed action. And I think even with the time period we're in right now, where it's New Year's, a lot of us might be, setting resolutions and looking forward in terms of setting goals. It's more timely to actually even focus on the values and the committed action piece. So what I want to do is actually quickly walk through what this actually looks like as part of ACT. And one, just quickly clarify what we mean by values, and specifically what we mean by values versus goals. And then also show you some exercises that we can do as part of ACT if you wanted to work on some of these commitment exercises. So very, very quickly, values are broad and ongoing. So unlike our goals over here on the other side, values are going to be something that we can't really achieve. They're ongoing, and they're more like a direction that we want to go into. And goals, in contrast, are actually things that we can achieve. So they're much more measurable and observable. We can often approach them step by step, and they have an evaluation criteria. So there's a very clear way to figure out if we actually achieved our goal or not. So we want to make sure that we have a clear idea of how these two things are different. And our goal here is really not to put them in competition with each other, but understand that we can do both of them. And if we do both of them, that we're going to be more successful, even at those goals that we're setting. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the values piece over here, and then just give a little bit more detailed description of it. And I'm actually going to read a quote by Dr. Russ Harris, which I really like in terms of describing what values are. And he writes, "Values are like a compass. A compass gives you direction and keeps you on track when you're traveling. And our values do the same for our journey of life. We use them to choose the direction in which we want to move and to keep us on track as we go. So when you act on a value, it's like heading west. No matter how far west you travel, you never get there. There's always further to go. The goals are like the things you try to achieve on your journey. They're like the sights you want to see or the mountains you want to climb while you're traveling, while you keep on traveling west." So again, this is really just drawing out that contrast of values really being part of that direction, and the goals might be the things that we either see or want to achieve along that direction. So some other clarifying remarks about just values very quickly. We often in ACT really emphasize that they're freely chosen and largely developed through our experience. And there's a lot of times where we have a lot of impact from other sources, whether it's other people around us or even media or other sources that might be telling us things that we should value. So, and in ACT, we really try to help the individual decide on what their values are based on their experience. So what they actually value as they reflect on their experiences. And again, we emphasize that aspect of it, that it's more of a direction, not a destination, and that it's really continuous. So there's no real way to achieve your values. I think we always make the joke that, you can't achieve your values by Sunday. You can only continue to move in the direction of your values. But of course, we also want to make sure that we're keeping this concept grounded. So our values are really substantiated in our actions. So for us to be able to move in the direction of our values, it's going to be through aligning our behaviors to represent that value. So here's some examples of what those values might look like. Things like courage, friendship, love, compassion, security. We can think of excellence, growth, justice, curiosity, and creativity. But really, it can be anything that could fall within that definition of more of a broad direction that we want to move in. And there's a lot of lists out there of different values. So this is a longer list that I'm not going to read. But you can see there's quite a bit of different values that we can go through. And a lot of times the value exercise is actually giving people the options, and even a list like this, and having them identify which of these values might be things that they really relate to and that they personally value. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but there's also some guidelines that I like to give. And one of them is to make sure that we're not picking too many, right? We want to keep it simple and prioritize what values we're going to really select as part of our value exercises. And this is not to say that we actually remove things off the list that we value, but look for a way to make sure that we can summarize it into a smaller list. And a lot of the values actually overlap. So we can think of, values of helping and compassion, and they might be close enough that we can put them under one category. So if we want to make sure that our values are going to be helpful for us on an ongoing basis, sometimes it's helpful to think about what are my 3 or 5 core values that I'm going to carry forward with me. And this really also helps in a functional way, because when we're looking at our values, we want to make sure that we're using them as reminders and anchors, especially in difficult times. So thinking about when there's a lot of other pressure on us, there's a lot of challenges that we're experiencing, our values can be a great way to anchor ourselves in the direction that we want to be moving towards, even when there's other forces that are pushing us in the opposite direction. It also helps to have the values on the top of our mind, because values are not going to be the only thing that are going to be drawing us forward. A lot of times there's other needs and desires that will also push us and pull us in different directions. And we can think about, things like that are important to us, things that we want to do because they're right, versus things that are going to make us money. Or I always like to bring up health examples. We might really value health and being healthy, but those cookies are still going to be just as tempting as they ever were. So we also want to make sure that we're able to clarify the difference between our needs and desires versus our values, and then also use our values in those moments of why am I going to make the hard decision of passing up on those wonderful holiday cookies. So we can use our values in a way to guide our behavior, again, to make our behavior more aligned with what those values are. So that's kind of the overall guidelines for values in a very quick way, and the definition for them. I also wanted to go over some exercises, and I'll show you a demonstration of this in a second. But I would probably say one of the most common ways of doing this is actually a value sort, where we make a list of values and then put them on a card. And we often give people ways to rank these values for themselves. So they can, rank them from 1 to 10, what's most important to the least important. And this just gives people a way to explore all the different values on the table and try to make some decisions about what are going to be more important and what will be less important to them. And there's a link down here for an online source where you can do some online activities related to the value sort. But this is actually a really good one, especially I think for school settings, for if you're doing this with students. It's a really great way to get students actively involved and taking a look through different values, especially if they haven't been exposed to a lot of the different values that might be on these cards. It can be a good way for them to learn about it and explore if that's a value that they actually hold. And a lot of times there's a fun modification of this, again, especially for, I think, younger individuals, but even for adults, where instead of the individual themselves picking the values and sorting them in terms of importance, we often ask another individual to sort it for them, just to give them the experience of someone else choosing your values for you. And usually no one likes that experience. We want to pick and choose our own values. But that can be a really good experiential exercise in a way to get people to really see that in a more concrete way. When someone else picks our values for us in a value sort, we're generally not happy about it.
I have a question. So when we're talking values, like for example, you mentioned health, and in my mind, I know that I should value health. I know that like my long-term goals, I want to be around for a long time. I want to be with my family. I want to be healthy enough to do the things that are, important in my life to be doing. And then you mentioned, the cookies. And so I know myself, I'm living in that, oh, that cookie is yummy, so I'm going to take that cookie. So when you're sorting values, are you asking people to sort the values that they're exhibiting and showing, or could these be aspirational? Like, I know that health should be more important than what I'm doing, and so that should be a value that I'm working on. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. And it's a hard one, because I think the one thing we don't want to do is pressure people into valuing things that they, air quotes, should value. So I think there's an element of, we could certainly be at a place where we realize we're not being healthy. We really do value our health. And from what you're saying, it's also tied to family and longevity of being around your family. And I think as long as we recognize that, it doesn't matter if we're actually doing very good by that value, right? So we could be at the very beginning of our journey and just starting to make some headway in that direction, but it could still be something that we value. And I think a part of when we're doing ACT, especially in a therapeutic setting, is having people recognize that that is something they value, even if they're as far away from it as they can be. And the idea is that you can always make that turn to move in that direction, no matter how long you've been moving in some other direction.
Awesome. That makes sense.
Yep. So, and that's actually a really important, it's a really good question, because I think the one clarification I often forget to give too is that values are not often tied to success. And that's an important piece, that it's more of a direction that we're choosing, and we're going to try our best to move in that direction. But it's not a guarantee, or again, that the idea that you're already successful in that direction, and as a result, you can value it. But as I was saying, like, the value sort is actually a great way to do this. And one thing I quickly wanted to share was that there's actually, during the pandemic, wonderful people like Jenna and Jason actually created virtual versions of this. So if you're still in a virtual environment, or find yourself in one, there's actually really nice digital ways to do this. And I'm gonna actually X out on my screen here. Hopefully it still will be sharing. Can you still see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay. So this slide, which you should have access to at the link that's shared, actually gives us digital cards. So we have some categories of this value is very important to me, this value is important to me, and this value is less important to me. And we can actually take this card over here. So hard work, I might say, that's important to me. And I can move the card over here. And then I have justice. I might say this is, very important to me. And I can actually keep going through this deck of cards. Peace, maybe peace is not that important to me, right? So I'm just making these up. Helpfulness, not so much. Contribution, maybe I find that very important. Problem solving a little bit. But this is just a nice digital way of doing the same thing we would do with cards. The nice thing about this is obviously we can always clean up our deck and reuse this if we want to. But the value sort it doesn't necessarily have to be very complicated. We can just have a series of cards, whether they're digital or paper, and help people sort them into different categories to see which ones are going to be the most valuable for them. We often even have students or clients of all ages write in their cards. So that's why we have the spare blank cards here. We can even write ours in, right? So we can talk about, healthy, if that's not on there, and use our own specific values if we don't see it as part of the deck that's given to us. So just another way to actually be able to do the same exercise, but again, in a digital format. Another way to explore this, and it's not exactly the same concept as values, is to look at character strengths, which is really kind of asking our question of, what type of a person do I want to be? What kind of character do I want to develop as an individual? And luckily, there's actually a few good surveys out there. The one that I typically tend to use is the viacharacter.org. And this is actually a very long survey. So it's something that if you want to do, you have to, I think, set aside a good amount of time. So it says 30 to 40 minutes. I've done this once, and it wasn't easy to get through all of those. It's 240 items. And it is something that's difficult to get through, but I think it does give us a good way to explore our values in a different format than, say, a card sort. So here's an example of what the survey looks like. And it asks a series of different questions that are a little bit indirect. Things like, I experience deep emotions when I see beautiful things. I always speak up in protest when I hear someone say mean things. And as you endorse these items, all 240 of them, it gives you a profile of what might be your character strengths. So again, not exactly the same thing as values, but is often helpful in getting that exploration started. And this survey I've actually used with high schoolers. There's actually an adolescent and an adult version of it. And again, it's not necessarily something I do very often just because of the length of it. But it can be a really good place for doing a deeper dive and exploring what your values might be, especially if you're not entirely sure based off of the terms you might find on a value card. This is giving you a lot more specific questions that you can answer and see what that reflects back at you. But my absolute favorite ways of actually exploring values, and the one that I often recommend, is actually ideal narratives. And a lot of these are actually to help us separate out, I think, the success factor when we think about values. And I think that's always a very hard thing to keep separate from what we actually do value. So the ideal narrative oftentimes is really helping someone write an ideal life. If they had a magic wand, they can remove all barriers. What would their life look like? What would they be doing in that situation? And of course, we can also contrast the ideal life with the not ideal and have them write the opposite as well. So if life wasn't going well, if things were going bad, what would that life look like? And this is just a writing exercise, a creative exercise to help, again, identify those things that are going to be really, really important. So if we, recognize friendship as one of our values, that might be something that's going to be very prominent in our ideal narrative, where friends and social gatherings with friends is the big part of our ideal life narrative. So this is a fairly easy exercise, assuming a basic level of writing ability for this, if we're working with students, and for adults as well. And there's a lot of fun variations of this. Some of them can be a little bit weird. So here's some versions of it that I've done. You can do an ideal narrative based off of a graduation speech, where you're either giving your own graduation speech or someone else is giving your graduation speech, and you want to write that highlighting all the things that represent you or things that are important to you. Same thing for a toast at a wedding, a retirement speech, and if you're want to get really morbid, your eulogy. Which actually is a very common part of a lot of the ACT exercises for values. And I think it's actually a really good one. It's morbid. So it's a little bit harder to sell, especially when you're working with younger students, but it's a little bit easier with adults. But it can be actually a very powerful exercise where you actually are reflecting, back on what you would want people to say at the end of your life, on what you stood for in your life. And a lot of times it's actually helpful to I think even diffuse from certain situations, certain thoughts that we might be stuck in the moment, right? If we're delayed on a project that we have to get in, and we're stressing about a deadline that we missed. I often actually go back and think about not necessarily a eulogy, but a tombstone, and I write here, here lies Imad. He missed a deadline. And I always think of that in that context. It sounds a little bit silly, right? It doesn't seem all that important in the grand scope of life. But in the moment, we can really be caught into that experience and really fuse with that experience. But for our values, this can be an important piece, right? So what we're looking back at our life, what would we want people to be saying? And if we want to have a little bit more fun with it, we don't have to just stick with the ideal narrative. Again, we can go the worst case scenario as well. So for all of these variations, you can imagine the worst speech being given versus the best speech that's being given, to help you even further contrast the things that you would want to be representing your life versus the things you wouldn't want them to be representing. There's also other variations of this. This one's a little bit more focused on self-compassion. So you can pretend like you're a friend writing a letter to yourself. And this is really to help cultivate that compassion piece and really reminding yourself of what's important. So if you are in a tough situation and you're struggling to, maybe find comfort in that moment, or even thinking about which direction you want to go into, you can actually write a letter to yourself as if you're the friend who's encouraging you and reminding you of what's important to you. So this is a nice way to, again, kind of take a different perspective and help to highlight what might be important for you in that situation, with the added bonus that you're also going to be adding a more of a compassion lens to the task as a whole. I always think of this in terms of how we're often actually a lot more compassionate towards other people than we are towards ourselves. We tend to be very harsh towards ourselves, and much more judgmental than we would be with a friend who's struggling with the same situation. So this is a nice one in terms of flipping that and asking us to think about how we would approach ourselves as another person. And here's just a little bit of a longer example. I actually use this one in class. I often actually will have my students. Sometimes you do this as an exercise, and it's not just actually on values. It actually focuses a little bit on other ACT processes as well. But it's still a narrative that we write down. So I'll just quickly read this. It's time for you to do some more imagining. In this exercise, you'll fast forward to 5 years from now and write a short story about what happened to you during those 5 years. Really try to apply all your creative, free thinking skills and don't hold back. This exercise may seem a little bit like make-believe, or maybe even a little like writing an essay in English class, but it's worthwhile work. And even if this seems like pretend, history shows that to do something, you have to think about it first. It's just a quick narrative, a creative exercise. And I usually give some very specific guidelines here, right? So we're going to imagine that it's 5 years from now. We're also going to imagine that we've acted on our top 3 values, whatever those values might be for us. And we're going to write out as part of our story, we're going to include 3 successes and satisfying experiences that occurred along the way. But we're also going to write about 2 things that went wrong, things that were obstacles or barriers that got in our way as well. So this is a little bit of a longer narrative, and again, it is pulling from other parts of ACT as well, but also helps us not only identify what those values are, but also how we might have moved forward in terms of moving in the direction of our values successfully. So just another way to be able to do the same value exercises. Okay, so next I wanted to cover goals, but I also wanted to pause to see if there was any more questions or anything about values before I move forward in terms of goals.
I don't have anything, Eric or Rebecca. You both have more experience with counseling, so maybe you have more functional questions than I do.
Well, I guess, I mean, the thing that I think about anytime I'm reading about ACT is often how could I translate this for young people? And I've been working a little bit with it with my students, and I find that this question, the feeling of, well, what am I supposed to value comes up a lot more strongly with young people, even than it does for us. So it really, I think, helps to have some conversations around, well, just what do you care about? What's important to you? What does your perfect day look like? So I'm thinking about how some of these exercises, even translated into conversations, into counseling conversations, could be so helpful for that, for young people to identify their values. Do you have any thoughts about that, of working with students and how to have them work on some of these exercises to identify their skills, their values?
Definitely. And before I actually answer that question, I also wanted to, I would like to point out, and I actually rarely ever actually apply ACT in my personal practice in counseling situations. So I've actually done a lot of work in schools applying ACT at the classroom level, and even having teachers lead some of these exercises for their classrooms. And even, at least in some of our schools, even doing it school-wide. So just keep that in mind, that I think a lot of these exercises, even though they come out of acceptance commitment therapy, we often change that to be broader to acceptance commitment training, just to keep that perspective of we don't necessarily have to make this a counseling activity. It could be even a social emotional learning activity as a lesson plan, where we're going over values. So we're actually introducing and even doing a little bit of psychoeducation, not necessarily responding to a challenge that might be happening in the counseling room. But I just wanted to throw out that clarification. But in terms of actually addressing, especially values, I think with younger clients in counseling, that is actually very challenging, partly because developmentally it doesn't really map on, especially for pre-adolescent age groups. And even with adolescents, values are really things that are cognitively something that students are just starting to understand. So they're not quite there yet in terms of they're when they get to young adulthood, into college, or whatever they're doing post high school. Values are going to be a lot more concrete of an idea for them. So a lot of times it is actually shifting the question to, what's important to you. What do you see in other people that you like, and making it more relatable, like we do with any other thing, and making it more developmentally appropriate. And a lot of times, actually, even helping the students recognize what they're telling us they value. So a lot of times, students will, mention things that are important to them, and when they're mentioning certain things, we can, think about how many times they're mentioning their friends, how many times they're mentioning their family members, and we can use those as little nudges to help them, see what's important for them. So if they mention their families a lot, we can, ask them, well, does it sound like families is something that you value? And we can even add that onto their card sort, right? And we can put families on their, if it's very young children, we can, put pictures with that as well. So there's modifications in that direction that we can make. I do also like to kind of mention that there is not a lot of research there, especially with very young children with ACT, and doing the values work. So I am cautious when I'm doing that, but I do try to use some of those modifications as I'm trying to apply them to younger and younger students.
That's great. Thank you. I think I do like what you said about like listening to what they're sharing as a way in to help them notice. I also find that often their emotions, they may not recognize that, that their emotions show what they care about as well. But if they're coming in and they're really upset because, the teacher gave them some feedback on their schoolwork that that bothered them, or, to help them see that, oh, well, you really care about doing well in school, or you care about this project or something like that, is a great way to get them to start to identify things that are important to them. But thank you.
Definitely. Yeah. So oftentimes in those heated moments, we always say the opposite of what you're upset about often is at least in some way a clue to what you might value. And if the child is calm enough in those heated emotions, we can often look to see what those values might be. But great questions on the value piece, and then a good point for clarification as well. So I'm going to move over to goals, and goals I always like to include here, even though the graphic here has verses. I really like to think of when we've done the values work, these are really valued goals. So even though I think we're all probably familiar with goal setting and various ways of doing this with students as well as ourselves, in ACT, we really want to bring the values piece into what we're doing with the goals. And one other thing that I always like to mention that's often involved in a lot of the ACT work is thinking about our goals across different life domains or context. And depending on which ACT protocol or version that you're using, there's often different categories that we often use. So just some simple version of this, we might be thinking about how our values might apply to our relationships, our work, our personal growth or health or leisure. And we can set certain goals under each one of these categories. And then there's also a lot longer list, kind of the same variety, but which is a lot more categories. So parenting, personal growth, spirituality, citizenship. And really, this is just up to you if it's helpful in determining what goals you want to be setting for the individuals that you're working with. I often find the simple list is simpler and it's easier to use. But a lot of times people pick the more specific categories because those might be more important parts of their life that they want to be addressing. But once we have all these things in place, this is where we can really start to make sure that we line up all these concepts together. So once we're in goals, this is where we really want to make sure we're going to be measurable and observable in our actions that are going to embody those values. So if we have values like friendship, and that falls in our life domain of relationships, now we can really start to set specific goals here. So we can have goals of we're going to spend time or maybe more time with our friends. We're going to start up conversations at a party. Maybe we're trying to make new friends. We can call to catch up with old friends if for doing calls or maybe texting. And we can even do things like writing a gratitude letter. If that's how we relate or connect with our friends. But there could be a whole number of goals over here. And this usually becomes a place where we actually stop and do a reminder that, this is where we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that this is embodying our value of friendship. And when I'm doing this in a school setting, oftentimes we have several students that actually identify friendship as their value. But we make it very clear that, your goal might not be the same. So depending on how you're approaching your friendships, you might have different goals. And that's okay, right? Our goals are going to be a lot, varied, even if we have the same exact value. Focus on our relationships. Some other things that I would like to mention is that obviously when we're setting goals, we always have these protocols like our SMART goals that help our goals to be more likely to be achievable. And I actually like the SMART goal framework, even though I think a lot of times we don't actually follow the actual labels, right? It's not necessarily all that achievable or realistic or timely. But I think the SMART protocol is actually a pretty good protocol. But even here, there's some modifications we can make to make it more aligned with acceptance commitment therapy, which might be just changing measurable to meaningful, right? To make sure that we're aligning with our values. And I think measurable can easily be contained in specific, right? So we make it specific enough that it's measurable. And then we can even take something like achievable to make it adaptive. And the adaptive can be focused on, is the goal likely to improve your life in some way? And again, the part of achievable can fall over on the realistic side, but we're now making room for the values piece, right? So what value does it align with? And I actually really like the adaptive piece, because I think a lot of times we might set goals, but maybe they're not that important, or they're not going to have that meaningful of an impact in our life. So it just reminds us to make sure that we're setting goals that are actually going to be meaningful and will actually improve our lives. So I often just change some of the acronyms here. And these examples are actually from Dr. Russ Harris's work. So he has a nice worksheet where you can work through the SMART goals with this variation. I always like to give a reminder, and I think it's always a good one, of thinking about scaling our goals. So we often have, obviously small steps that we're taking towards our goals, to maybe even having some sub goals. And it can be a very long time before we reach a big goal. So those might be, especially for students, a lot of times, getting through school, getting through high school to college, and even if they go to graduate school. And these can be very long, extended goals. And we want to make sure we spread out everything from the steps we're taking to the sub goals to the big goals. Things, again, that we're going to be very, very familiar with. Another twist on this that I think that I often tend to use as part of focus on acceptance commitment therapy is not necessarily just thinking about our goals and actions that are going to be leading to something big in the end, but just thinking about what actions we can take over time that align with our values. So, if we're thinking about actions that we can take, we can think about this in very long term, right? What can we do over a 6-year period? And that might be, again, graduating at a certain point in your educational career, or, working towards a big advancement in work. We can also think about this in a smaller time period of, what can we do in the next 6 months to move towards our values? What can we do in the next 6 hours, right? So making it even smaller. It's pretty late in the day right now, but if it was earlier, we can think about what I'm planning on doing in the next 6 hours for my work. But even going down to seconds, right? So what can I do in the next 6 seconds that's going to be an action I'm taking towards my value? And a lot of times I like to give people options and help them even identify different steps across these different time scales, just to recognize that whatever they're working at, whether they have 6 seconds or 6 years, they could still be taking some action to help them move in the direction of their values. Even if they've started to move in another direction occasionally, they can always take those 6 seconds to start moving back in the direction of what their values might be. So there's different ways to think about how to approach those goals once you've set them, especially just kind of, again, bringing in those concepts of values into the work of setting goals and taking action. And then the one reminder that I always like to give here is that whenever I'm doing ACT, especially with younger students, even teenagers, is and I'll even throw an adult in there, is that there's a ongoing tendency to mix up values and goals, and we might even clarify this up front and really get that separation of understanding that values are more of a direction, whereas goals are going to be much more specific and concrete things that we do in that direction. But it's very easy to kind of sneak in goals as the value. And I always like to give examples of when I used to work at a high school where a lot of the students were looking to get into very prestigious schools, a lot of the Ivy League schools. And when we would ask them what their values were, they actually had a very hard time answering that question. And a lot of times when we asked them, they would actually tell us getting into Harvard, right? That was what their value was. And we would actually use a lot of the clarifying parts of the values piece in ACT to say, well, is that a direction or is that more of a goal? Is that something you can actually, achieve one day? And they would actually recognize this. But then as we started to work towards putting a plan in place, how they're going to work towards a goal, say they have the value of growth, and Harvard is one of the goals they might have along that way. Over time, we would find that they start to switch those again, right? So the value really becomes going to Harvard. So we often actually ended up doing similar exercises that I mentioned earlier, where we're doing a value sort. But now we actually do some discrimination training in the sense that we throw in some goals into those cards, and we help students work to sort out the values and then sort the goals under those values. And a lot of times these are the values and the goals that they themselves have set. But this becomes kind of a reminder exercise to make sure that they're keeping those two things separate but aligned, right? That having that valued goal rather than values or goals. So this I always put at the end over here, because I think as, again, we start moving towards the goals, people tend to kind of confuse the two together. So a lot of times this becomes a good way to just as a reminder and to make some course corrections along the way. Okay, so just going to pause quickly again and see if there's any quick questions or comments on the goals before we move to the last piece on metaphors.
I was just thinking, and thank you for that clarification before about, because in my mind, I was originally thinking about working, on like an IEP goal with a particular student, and I can see how that, could be done absolutely with ACT, but I think that broadening that and looking at a whole class-wide or group-wide and using some of the activities, that makes a lot of sense. And so now as I'm kind of picturing some of this, I'm picturing this on a kind of a grander scale. And I think that makes, a lot of sense. And even working with, students who are, potentially going to Harvard and all these things, that they're still finding benefit in these types of activities. And I think benefit for us as school psychologists too, in the work that we do, and looking through that scope to help us as we navigate our own, difficulties in meeting timelines and deadlines and all those things. So thank you. I'm looking for questions and comments, and I don't see any questions or anything at this point. I do want to, though, before you move on, say that my district has canceled school for tomorrow because I have a snow day. So everyone go, yay for Rachel. But that's
well, hopefully we'll hear more cancellations for tomorrow. So, but that's certainly good news.
So now we need ACT to work through the jealousy and resentment that we have toward Rachel.
That'll be for the next session.
And that actually makes me think, when you were asking Rachel about how values can sometimes, you can have a value but not necessarily, act in accordance to it. Mm-hmm. I feel as though when that happens regularly enough, if it really is a strong value, that's when probably you will feel some distress. Would you agree, Dr. Zaheer, that like if I do value my health, yet I cannot control my Oreo cookie eating, little free shout out to Oreo there, then eventually it's going to make me not feel well or like not happy with myself. Is that right?
Yes, definitely. And I bring up the cookies because I've been eating a lot of holiday cookies myself. So I think it's definitely distressing. I think and one of the things about ACT, as I was showing earlier in the slides, that there's many different components to it, and we're focusing on the values and committed action piece. But one of the things that a lot of times we experience as we start to select that direction in terms of our values and make committed action is that we actually often experience more distress because we really identified that this is really important to us. And just like anything that we're trying to improve on, we're probably not going to be that great at it at first, right? So a few Oreos will make it through, right? And a few, whatever we're focused on, we're going to first realize we're not maybe doing too good in it, right? We're not used to moving in that direction. To give even a more serious example, I often think about the value of we're thinking about social justice issues. I think about anti-racism, and that's a topic where that's a value and a direction that I want to move in. But a lot of times when I'm trying to do that, it's also helping me highlight all the ways I'm not doing that, and that's very, very distressing. So I think it's a lot of the components of ACT actually I think play well together in that a lot of the acceptance skills are actually very helpful for us in handling that distress, right? And we know when we're thinking about race-related work, there's a backfire effect where if we experience a lot of distress, we tend to actually get more ingrained in the perspectives that we're in and actually start to move in the other direction. So if we're doing this work, especially if we're doing it for very, very challenging situations, we really want to make sure we bring in, how to be better at opening up to our experiences and being more in the present moment, as well as committing to moving forward in terms of what actions we're taking towards our values. But that's definitely a good point. I think it can be very distressing, especially when we really recognize that this is a value that we want to move towards.
I'm also kind of thinking too, like as we were talking with the health example, and when I was talking about the reasons for why health, maybe I should be valuing health. Again, I reference like my family and being able to do things with them. So I'm thinking about like maybe my value is more so family, and that like I should maybe my goals or some of my goals should be aligned to health, tied into kind of family, if that makes sense. So and leading students in a healthy direction, maybe based on I guess you wouldn't immediately think that health and family. So yeah, maybe I'm thinking my value is more family, and that in thinking of that, health would be an appropriate goal to get me more family time and to be more present for my family. Does that make sense? Is that kind of along the lines of?
Yeah, I think health could probably certain aspects of being healthier could be goals, right? You can say I'm going to run, I'm going to eat healthier, I'll try to get better sleep. But I think health could count as a value, like it's a direction you're always trying to be healthy, right? And it's not something you can't like be on a diet till Sunday and then stop, and then you've achieved healthiness. I think that's at least still meets the criteria for value. But I think you're making a great point in that I think a lot of times we recognize that some values may not be the priority, right? And it's family is really the priority, and health maybe is a second or third priority underneath that. And also it's partly there because it's actually helping the priority, which is the family. So it's a little bit individual, but they're definitely often lead to conflicts of values, right? So I think I actually work with a lot of young adults who were kind of in the same situation where they want to be healthy, they want to live long and be around loved ones, but we're finding themselves spending almost all their time in a gym, or not being comfortable at social events because cookies are being served or food that they would find unhealthy, and they were finding that was conflicting with their ability to be with loved ones and the family that they also value. So it was a little bit of finding a balance between being healthy but also being with the family members, and that does happen, right? So that's value conflicts even within yourself. And I think it's as part of ACT, we can try to help the individuals prioritize, not just figure out these are the 3 things that I value, but what's the priority out of the values that I hold.
Totally. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And because I'm thinking too about, Rebecca and Eric, who are avid runners and in the gym and doing all these things. And so when my initial is like, yeah, I value health, I don't value health, I feel like in the same way that Eric and Rebecca do. And they're so, I think they're more, in it for the health and all the big things that I'm just like, I would be more so in it for,
Right.
adding an extra year to my life to,
Yeah.
so different levels of yes. So I can totally see that.
And I can even see that change over time. Like I grew up, or when I was young, I was on a track team, and I always enjoyed, running and other activities that are, that lead to health. But as I get older, I'm actually concerned about, longevity and being around family members. And so in some ways, that that's grown for me in terms of what I value and why those actions are important. And I have more reasons for why those things are valuable to me now than I did when I was younger. Any other?
We did have a question that popped up. Do you support doing ACT trainings online, and do you recommend any in particular?
I think there are a lot of great trainings online. There's, I believe, I might not get the website correct. I think Praxis has a lot of good online ACT courses. The only warning that I give is that we know this from just our research in school psychology is that we really learn things by doing. So I think online trainings are great for getting exposure, getting used to the concepts. But I think the best way to do it is to find someone that can give you some supervised experience, especially as you're applying these principles. And I think that could be a great way to learn ACT. And I think a lot of times that's kind of what I've noticed is that a lot of people that get the online trainings, the knowledge certainly increases and they get exposure to the ideas. But it can be fairly difficult to translate that into everyday practice. I think especially as school psychologists, because a lot of the ACT work has been done in clinical psych and adults. So there's a little bit of a translation that we have to do when we're working within our settings in school and for slightly different, contexts. Any other questions or?
I don't see anything else right now, and I know that we're short on time and I want to be respectful of your time. So I'll pass it back to you for anything else.
Sure. So I'll quickly end on this too. And so one thing that ACT also often does, and depending on how people practice it, is often using a lot of metaphors. So not getting too stuck in arguments or explaining, but really using metaphors to bring together a lot of the ideas. So one that I really like, and it's one of the classics in ACT, is actually the passengers on the bus metaphor. And this just is to help us remember some of the ideas that we're trying to relate as we're doing ACT with individuals. And the passengers on the bus is really this metaphor where we are actually the bus driver, and we might be headed down this value direction. And again, we might have some goals along that direction as we're going there. And we notice that we also have passengers with us here. And these passengers are rowdy passengers, right? These might be uncomfortable thoughts or feelings or memories or sensations that we might have. And they're so uncomfortable that these rowdy passengers, oftentimes when they start to get rowdy and scream at us, they often make us actually take a detour, right? So moving away from those things that we value, right? They might even be threatening us, like we have to take this turn over here. And as a result, we do it, right? So this might be where our anxiety is really increasing and we avoid something that might be important for us. So we can think about this in terms of, anything that we value and what might be certain things that show up for us, right? It might be a traumatic memory that really prevents us from moving in a direction that we really value, or, thoughts that show up that make it hard for us to move forward. We can also think about this in terms of actual roadblocks or bumps on the road. So some external barriers that we might also experience as we're trying to move towards our values. And these external barriers or bumps on the road could be time limits, resources, system or structural challenges, or relational challenges, right? Working with other people that might also prevent us from moving forward in terms of what we value. So as we're thinking about this passengers on the bus metaphor, we can kind of think about all these ideas together, right? So as we're driving down this road, maybe in the direction of what we value, first we really have to make sure we got that direction right? We're actually moving in a direction that we value, not something that maybe someone else values. And as we're doing that, we want to be aware of the passengers on the bus and how they might even convince us to go into another direction. And even though that might, sway the passengers and they might calm down, ultimately that's not going to be helpful for us long term, because now we're moving in a different direction that from our own values. And even if we're moving in that direction, we want to be aware of the fact that there actually are bumps on the road, and that might require some detours or going, slightly in a different direction until we can get back. But we can kind of think about all these things together and try to see, using all the different ACT skills, not just the ones that I was covering today in terms of values and goals, to better be able to navigate this landscape and continue to move towards our values, even if it's not a straight line, right? So just all through the bumps in the road, as well as the rowdy passengers, still moving, long term in the direction of our values. So just a very, very quick metaphor to help remind us of all the ideas that ACT often covers, and can be useful as an easy way to remember all those ideas. Okay, so that's actually exactly where I wanted to stop. And I know we're pretty much at the end of our time here. And that's probably quite a bit of information on January 2nd. One quick announcement that I just wanted to make, and I hope this is okay. We are actually starting a NASP interest group on contextual behavioral science, which is actually covering third wave behavioral approaches like ACT, as well as DBT and other mindfulness-based CBTs and mindfulness-based interventions. And I'm doing this with my colleague, Dr. Tyler Renshaw. So if anyone is interested and is an NASP member, we do have a link to our SurveyMonkey over here. And this is a group that we're hoping we can set up to really explore ACT as well as related approaches, especially for school psychologists, and even thinking about some things that I mentioned earlier of not just in counseling or in therapy, but also thinking about our broader school systems and applying ACT in terms of the whole school or in the classroom and in other contexts as well. So just wanted to throw that out there in case anyone would be interested in supporting it. We're looking to get enough signatures to get the group approved. And once we do, we can start with some fun activities. But other than that, I wanted to stop there and say thank you. My email is here if anybody wanted to reach out. But again, thank you again for having me on the podcast and allowing me to express some of these ideas from ACT.
Thank you so much. They're always fascinating and helpful, and I'm so excited about the interest group. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm going to look at our schedule quick too before we break. I know that 1:16, it looks like we've got Dr. Brian McClure back to speak with us, so that will be exciting for everybody. But thank you so much. I mean, I love all the great functional things too that I feel like I could go and work with students tomorrow if I wasn't on a snow day and implement some of these things and have it and be enjoyable for them and worthwhile. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and hopefully, I should have mentioned that at the beginning that, as school psychologists, these are probably things that we can do as well, right? What are our professional values? What are goals that we're setting, and how we can actually better move forward if we consider that values piece along with our goals.
Yeah.
That's great. It's very practical.
Great.
Awesome. Okay, I think we're all gonna say goodbye then. Thank you everybody for joining us.
Right,
Thanks everyone. Good luck this week.